we divided the whole sermon into 3 parts. We looked at Isaac's life and we said, the steps of the righteous are ordained by the Lord. And then we looked at his life and we said, the stops of the righteous are ordered by the Lord. And then we kind of came into a point where we understood from his life that the sufficiency of the righteous are centered in the Lord. So those are the 3 points that I shared last week, but we can actually look in Genesis 26 and look at Isaac's life and see why we say that the steps of the righteous are ordered by the Lord. So here we are in Genesis 26. Psalm 37:23 says that's that verse, that the steps of a good man are ordered by the Lord. You can see it in Psalm 37:23. And in Isaac's life, Isaac went through a time where he was in the midst of a famine. Genesis 26 begins with these verses. Now there was a famine in the land, besides the previous famine that had occurred in the days of Abraham. Now, if you look at this chapter, and if you read chapter 21 in Genesis, you see Abraham having a very similar events. All these events that are happening in Isaac's life right now happened at one point in Abraham's life. They both are doing things similar. They both are walking in the same way. They're going into the same places. They're meeting the same people, or the people in authority have the same names, and they both do the same mistakes, and both of them come out of it. And so you see parallel events recorded in the life of Abraham and Isaac at this point. And we kind of defined famine last week. We said that was slide 3, Joshua. We said that famine is a prolonged state of hunger or unmet need with the failure to experience satisfaction. Now, we said that unmet needs, dry seasons, unanswered prayers, spiritual weariness, and unfruitful ministry, prolonged joblessness or poverty. And these are all some examples of famine where we can say that, I am going through a famine in my life. My prayers are not being answered for such a long time. I have been waiting on the Lord, and I feel that I am in a state of famine right now. So that is the definition of famine that I shared last week. And we also said that famines reveal our hunger. Famines show what we are really craving for. And famines also change people. While you go through a famine, you do things that you previously would not even think about doing in a negative way. Some things that were not acceptable when times of plenty becomes acceptable in times of famine in a very negative way. And so famines affect people and famines change people. And we said that if we are to survive a famine, we have to have fellowship with the God who allowed famine. That was slide 4. So when we go through famine, the only thing that perhaps will be a lifeline for us in the famine would be fellowshipping with God. Because we saw that in the famine, how God fellowshiped with Isaac. God gave him clear directions. In Genesis chapter 26, when it says, now there was a famine in land, and Isaac was going to a place called Gerar. Now Gerar is where the king Abimelech is ruling over. And Abraham had been there in times of his famine. And now we see his son Isaac moving into that place. And God gives Isaac this clear direction during the time of famine that, Isaac, you're not going to go to Egypt. Stay in this land and I will bless you and I will take care of you. And that is what Isaac proceeds to do in the rest of the chapter. And so we kind of defined famine. We said that famine fuels us to have fellowship with the fullness of God. And then we see that in this famine, Isaac decided to obey the Lord. Isaac exactly plays out his life, the rest of his life, in the direction that God gives him. He decides to obey the Lord, listens to the voice of the Lord, he obeys the Lord, and he goes on to do exactly those things that the Lord told him. And chapter 26, verse I believe it was verse 12. Chapter 26, verse 12 says, now Isaac sowed in that land and reaped in the same year 100-fold, and the Lord blessed him. So as a result of Isaac listening to the voice of the Lord, doing exactly what God said in the time of famine, he came to a place where he was blessed by the Lord. And now we entered into a new phase in Isaac's life. It is not anymore we can say steps of the righteous are ordered by the Lord. We can also add to it and say stops of the righteous are ordered by the Lord. So here he is in famine, blessed by the Lord, and he is entering into a new phase in his life. He's been blessed by the Lord. The Lord gave him 100-fold in times of famine, and there was a new problem at that place. Now the commander or the king of the land comes to him and says, you have been blessed and you are too powerful for us. You have to leave this place. And this is in verse 16 of chapter 26, where Abimelech said to Isaac, go away from us. You are too powerful for us. So Isaac departs from there and camps in the valley of Gerar. So I said that when you are blessed by the Lord, when you have all these blessings because you obeyed the Lord, it doesn't mean that everything is going to be fine and dandy from there on. You will also see stops in your life. And one of the stops that Isaac, the first kind of stops that Isaac faced was when he was asked to leave the place that he was supposed to be camping in. God told him to stay in this land, but he was asked to leave the place, and he had to leave. And after he left Gerar, he moved on and he camped. It says in verse 17, Isaac departed from there and camped in the valley of Gerar. So he didn't go too far from there, because again, this is because God had told him to stay in the land. He didn't go to a new place. He went a little further and he decided to settle there. Now, every time Isaac would settle in a place, there's a pattern in his life. He does something called redigging the well. So, like I said, Abraham had previously sojourned in this land. Abraham had dug some wells over there, and Isaac is familiar with these wells that his father dug when he was there. So Isaac goes and redig the wells that his father Abraham had already dug. Well, now the reason for redigging is because the people of that land, envy is not only their only problem. Now they asked Isaac to leave the land because they were envious of the blessing the Lord had given them. And we also said last week that envy was not the only problem that these people had. They had another problem. They would go and fill these wells that had been dug by Abraham with mud and dirt. So whatever wells that Abraham did or made was with the intention that this would be for my next generation as well. He was not digging well just for himself. He was also doing this. When an ancient Jew dug a well, it meant a lot more than just for themselves. It meant for provision for the next generations. And so these people would not allow these wells to remain there. The people of the land would go and fill it up with dirt. Now filling a well with dirt meant warfare in those times. So Isaac would go and redig the wells of his father Abraham. And putting dirt and filling up a well that was dug for generations is ruining your name, your legacy, and your identity. Everything that reminded Isaac of his heritage, his calling, and his destiny was declared war against in that place. And that's when we said that these are the stops that Isaac faced in his life. Every time there's a claim on your identity, every time there was dirt put on your legacy or your heritage, and you can't see the truth to your calling or your heritage, and these are the times you need to remind yourself that this is not from the Lord, this is the enemy's work, and this is what he's really good at. Every time you dig a well, and that reminds us of trying to seek the Lord and finding the truth. You know that when people dig a well in those times, how much investment goes into it. It was like, water was scarce in those times. And to dig a well and find water meant to land a job that you can't even think about at this time. That means it is going to provide for you all your life and some more. And so it was comparable to what Isaac was doing at that time. So when these wells that were dug at one point and water was found at one point, and the livestock and people drank from it and farmers used it, and then to put mud on it and dirt on it was declaring warfare and stopping the work of these people. So we said that these stops that Isaac faced were cruel, were unjust, and Isaac shows us how to respond to it. What Isaac does? He moves on every time they claims a well. So he redigs the well, And the people in the land comes and quarrels with him and says, that water is ours. This is in verse 20. So he names, the first well that he made, he names it Esek, because they contented with him. The word Esek means contention. And so he understands that, okay, these people are claiming for his work. After they put dirt in it and after he redug it and found water, they are claiming these wells. So he let it go and he names it contention. And then he decides to move on. He finds another place, he redigs that well. And what happens over there is, the people of that land, they come and they quarrels over it too. This is in verse 21. Then they dug another well and they quarreled over it too, and he names it Sitna. Sitna means hostility or accusations. And Isaac shows us what to do when these kind of things happens in our life. So there is strife, there is contention, there is accusations, it is just stepping up. And the second time people comes and claims his work and accuses him, he leaves that too. And he moves on. And he names it Sitna. And verse 22 says, he moved away from there and dug another well that they did not quarrel over. Okay, that the third well that he made, people did not come for it, they did not quarrel over it, and he names it Rehoboth. He names it Rehoboth, saying, at last the Lord has made room for us, and we will be fruitful in the land. Now there is a key phrase here that we mentioned last week, at last. And we said that, the people who outlast, there is an at last. There is an at last for people who outlast. So Isaac moves away a couple of times, and then finally he's coming to this place called Rehoboth, and he says, finally the Lord is blessing us. This is slide 8, Joshua. Finally the Lord is blessing us, and there is an at last for those who outlast. And that is when we said that the sufficiency of the righteous is actually centered in the Lord. You don't have to go back and fight for your rights sometimes. You don't have to go back and claim what, the claims where the claims are already there. You move on and you find that the Lord will bring you to broad places. The Lord will bring you to broad places, and Isaac named it that broad place Rehoboth, and he said, finally the Lord will make us fruitful here. But interestingly, you should think that, now this is what we discussed last week, this was all a summary. Now we are moving on to what I really wanted to say this week. Now we think that, okay, Isaac is in this fruitful place. He had his claims on the well that people came and took back from him, and he faced strife, contention, accusations, and it only stepped up, and finally he let go of everything, and he finally came to a place, he's fruitful now. What would we do? We are happy. We have landed that job that we always wanted. It is going to take care of all the needs. Finally, we are in a broad place. Rehoboth means broad. We are broad, in a broad place, and we are fruitful. What should we do? We should settle here, and we should make tents, and we should live happily forever, right? And that's what I thought Isaac would do, until I found the next verse that says, this is Genesis chapter 26. Verse 22 was where we read about Rehoboth. He moved away from there and dug another well, and they did not quarrel over it. So he named it Rehoboth, for he said, at last the Lord has made room for us, and we will be fruitful in the land. And I thought, that's it, glory, hallelujah, Isaac has reached his fruitful place. But verse 23 says, then he went up from there to Beersheba. Why would somebody leave a fruitful place and go to Beersheba? Why would Isaac, after all this that he endured in the famine, he was thrown away from some places. He had people having hatred and accusation and, strife and contention, and he just outlasted all these enemies. Came to a place of fruitfulness where he had all this fruitful abundance. He leaves that place for Beersheba, if I'm saying it right. Why would he do that? We have no clue, because the Bible is silent on that. We don't know what happened that made him move, although some commentators say that there was still problems with the well, and it is not said here, but you can only imagine, and you can only make up your own definitions and your own comments about that. But I see one thing that happened after he moved to Beersheba. We don't have to speak when the Bible is silent, but we can look when the Bible talks. You see, in verse 23, it says that he went up from there to Beersheba. Now, it says went up from there, okay? Every time Isaac moved, it either said he departed from there or he went away from there. This is a place it says he went up from there. This time he's moving up. This man has moved many times in his life to get to fruitfulness. And every time he moved, this man depended on the situations. When doors closed, he moved. When doors were hostile, he moved. So he was using situational wisdom all his lifetime to decide the will of God or to decide what is best for him. And he kept moving. Until he came to this place, we see that there is no situational wisdom here. There is nothing that makes him move, but he still moves. And it says that he moves up. There's only one clue that tells us what it is, and that is in verse 24. I believe that from the place of fruitfulness, Isaac moved up to the place of fullness. That is the only reason I have is because if you read verse 24, it says, the Lord appeared to him the same night. That is, the same night he moved to Beersheba. The night he moved to Beersheba, before he might have turned in the U-Haul, before even the boxes were unpacked, or perhaps even before he assembled all his furniture back, the Lord appeared to him the same night and said, I am the God of your father Abraham. Do not fear, for I am with you. I will bless you and multiply your descendants for the sake of my servant Abraham. And so Isaac proceeds to build an altar there and called upon the name of the Lord and pitches his tent there. Okay, so before even he got time to do anything else, right after he moved, the Lord appears to him. And there is only twice it is mentioned that God appeared to Isaac or God spoke to Isaac. The first was in the time of famine when he had fellowship with the Lord. And the second, only the last recorded incident where God speaks to him, compared to the many incidences where God speaks to Abraham, or compared to the many incidences where God will again speak to Jacob. Isaac in the middle, this man in the middle only has 2 recorded incidences where God speaks to him. And the last recorded incident was here when he moved to Beersheba. So I believe Beersheba is the place of the presence of God. And Isaac all his life was moving towards the fullness of God. God was using situations, God was using people, God was using all these things to move him up to the place where he wouldn't even settle down in a place of fruitfulness, but he had to move to the place of fullness of God. And that is my only logic that I see here why Isaac would move to Beersheba. Now, it is also interesting about the things that he does in Beersheba compared to the things that he did in other places. You know, when he moved to other places because of strife, because of contention, because of accusations, because of all these claims that people had on his life and his work, his pattern was to go to a new place, start digging another well. So he was a man who would work, right, to prove, or work to find. Now in Beersheba, interestingly, the man got his priorities right. He moves to Beersheba. The first thing he would do after he had the appearance with the Lord is he built an altar for the Lord there. Verse 25 says, so he built an altar and then he called upon the name of the Lord. So he built an altar. This is the first recorded incidence of Isaac ever building an altar. Other than being on the altar when his father was about to sacrifice him. This is the first time he is building an altar. And what does he do after that? He worships. He calls on the name of the Lord and he worships the Lord. And then he builds a tent there. And then only he proceeds to dig the well. So that was a fourth part. Digging the well was not priority for this man anymore. His priorities became right in Beersheba. In Beersheba, in the presence of the Lord, in the place of fullness that he came to, he got his priorities right. When he got his priorities right, so many other things happened in Beersheba. So that is exciting. We'll get to that. So God is step by step making good and on his promises and showing his faithfulness to Isaac. Now we see that Beersheba had another significance. When Abraham was going through famine, this story is mentioned in Genesis 21. When Abraham was going to famine, when I opened, I said that there are parallel events happening between Isaac's life and Abraham's life. Same things that happened here happened in Abraham's life. Same places they went, same people they met, same mistakes they did. So when Abraham was in Beersheba, he also had well problems. Okay, So people would come and take away the well that he had worked on. And the ruler of the land, Abimelech, and you see that Abimelech was the ruler of the land at the time of Abraham as well as at the time of Isaac, and the only logical explanation to it is Abimelech was a name of the dynasty, not the person. So it was just the last name, or they took the name of Abimelech for the kings. So Abraham meets Abimelech, and Abimelech comes and says, I see that you are blessed of the Lord. Let's enter into a treaty that you will not harm us and I will not harm you. Abraham says, that is all well and good, but I have a problem. My well is being taken over by your servants. And Abimelech says, I didn't know about this. So Abraham says, yes, this happened, but I would like to take it back from you. You have to take all these 7 ewe lambs from me. And then that tells me that you're happy, you have taken these ewe lambs, and this is now mine. The well is now mine. So Abraham actually bought this well by paying money, by investing and by paying money and making it right with the king, and he had stopped all these problems and he made it right with the king, and he had bought this well in Beersheba. And when he did that, the next thing he proceeded to do was, after all this was done, he actually threw a big party and he called upon the name of the Lord there as the everlasting God. That was the first time the name everlasting God is given in the Bible. God reveals to Abraham as the everlasting God. And Abraham proceeds to celebrate God as the everlasting God in that place. So you see Isaac coming back to that place, the very same place, and building an altar for God there, and worshipping God there, was almost a step in Isaac's life where he's coming back to the place where his father had an encounter with the everlasting God. And that is almost like saying, God, I had this fruitfulness in Rabbot, but I'm not happy, I'm not content. I am moving on to the fullness place of the fullness of God. I'm letting go of fruitfulness for the fullness of God. And he comes back to take cover under the everlasting God. And that is why he has this amazing experience of God himself coming and appearing to him and blessing him in Beersheba. And interestingly, Bible says that in Proverbs 16:3, I believe, the Bible says that when a man's way is pleasing to the Lord, he makes even his enemies at peace with him. Right? So when Isaac comes to Beersheba, Isaac got his priorities right. Everything is in the premise of worship. He begins to worship God first, and then only do his house and tent, and then only digging the well. So he got his priorities right. And what happens next is just amazing. What happens next is that the same person who asked Isaac to leave Gerar, King Abimelech, comes to him at Beersheba. Now, if you read Genesis chapter 27, verses 26 and to 30, it says, Then Abimelech came to him from Gerar with his advisor and Phicol, the commander of his army. Isaac said to them, Why have you come to me now, since you hate me and you have sent me away from you? They said, We see plainly that the Lord has been with you. Is that right? Because some verses before I see that Abimelech said, go away from us, for you are too powerful for us. Right? And now he comes back to Isaac saying, We see plainly that the Lord has been with you. So we said, Let there now be an oath between us, even between you and us, let us make a covenant with you, that you will do us no harm, just as we have not touched you and we have sent you away in peace. For you are now the blessed of the Lord. You see, the chapter began with saying, now there is a famine in the land. And it almost ends here in verse 29 saying, now you are the blessed of the Lord. Our God is a God of reversals. Our God can reverse things around. People who said, please leave this place, you are too powerful for us, is coming back to him saying, let's make an oath. We see that you are now the blessed of the Lord. And so he does that. They get up in the morning and they exchange oaths, and it is unbelievable that, that restoration takes place over there, that reconciliation takes place over there. And the man who was always led by situational wisdom is now being led by spiritual wisdom to move to Beersheba. All his life he looked at situations and he decided. But now he has come to a place where he looks at what he wants. He wants fullness. It is not fruitfulness he wants anymore. He wants fullness, and he was led by spiritual wisdom. In Colossians chapter 1, there is this beautiful prayer where it says that, where Paul is praying for his church, and he says that, I pray that the will of God would be made, you will know the will of God with all spiritual wisdom and understanding. That's a good prayer for us to pray over us and for our children, that we will continue to know, understand, and decipher the will of God with all spiritual wisdom and understanding. So I see Isaac slowly progressing in his spiritual life, from looking at situational wisdom to spiritual wisdom, moving towards the fullness of God. And then I also wanted to say the difference between Rehoboth and Rehoboth and Beersheba. Rehoboth is a place of absence of enemies, because he had moved from so many times, and when he made his well, when he dug his well in Rehoboth, nobody had any claim to it, and he said, finally, at last, we have this for ourselves, we are fruitful here. So Rehoboth is a place of absence of enemies, but Beersheba is a place of presence of God. Rehoboth is a place of physical enlargement, but Beersheba is a place of spiritual encounter. Rehoboth pleases you. In Beersheba, God is pleased with you. In Rehoboth, you dwell and dig. In Beersheba, you build the altar. In Rehoboth, you are the fruitful one. In Beersheba, you are the faithful one. In Rehoboth, you only saw the beginning of broad ways. Rehoboth means broad ways. God has enlarged us. In Beersheba, you sum up the border of your inheritance. Rehoboth is the broad place where you are fruitful in your walk. Beersheba is the border place where you inherit the walk. In Beersheba, Isaac was coming under the covenant of everlasting God. And God is pleased with him here. And when man's ways are pleasing to God, he makes even his enemies at peace with him. And you see that everything turned around for him. God of great reversals, reversing the situation in his life. And then something else happens there. While this is happening, while they're eating and drinking with Abimelech, who had come to now be at peace with Isaac, something else happens. In verse 31, they arose early, exchanged oaths, and then Isaac sent them away, and they departed from him in peace. Verse 32. Now it came about on the same day. I like this chapter because there are so many, at last, there are so many verses that says on the same night. And here it says on the same day. On what day? On the day that he had peace with his enemies, that the Lord had given him peace with his enemies. On the same day that Isaac's servants came in and told him about the well which they had dug, and said to him, we have found water. On the same day. On the same day. Probably Abimelech must have not even reached back home. And Isaac's servants comes back and tell him that we have found water. Let me tell you, this man has dug so many wells. He made so many wells in his life. He redug the wells. Some of them he dug. This was the last well that the Bible records that he has ever dug. It doesn't say Isaac made another well. So I believe when you move to a place of fullness, when you left fruitfulness for fullness and he moved into a place of spiritual wisdom and fullness of God, and they found water, I believe that water was the living water. I believe that water was enough to satisfy him, that he did not have to make any more attempts at digging wells again. And so he calls it Shiba, which means oath of 7 wells, just remembering what his father had experienced and how his father had given those 7 ewe lambs to Abimelech and brought that well. And so he names it Sheba, and that is how the city is again called Beersheba to this day. So the thrown out is now sought out. Now we see that there was a famine, and we saw that now you are blessed. And on the same day, his servants announced that they found water. Now, so like I said, he did not dig another well. He found the ultimate water, and that was enough for Jacob. That was enough for Isaac. And he lived, I think the rest of the life he lived in Beersheba, except before his death he moved to Bethel. He was in the place where his father and his mother were buried just before the time of death. The rest of the time he was living in Beersheba. So from this beautiful story, we see that the steps of the righteous are ordained by the Lord. whether it is famine or whether you are being blessed by the Lord, wherever you are, whatever situations your life is going through, it is ordained by the Lord. He knows it. He has placed you there. And we also know that the stops of the righteous are ordered by the Lord. There might be stops that, it might not even be the Lord giving these stops. That is a beautiful thing in Isaac's life. If you look at it, the Lord had asked him to stay in that place, yet he found so many stops right there. So it might not be the Lord doing it, but he allowed it, and it was, it was just enemy's work. It was just one after the another. He faced stops in his life. And through those stops, we see that Isaac kept on moving forward until he found Rehoboth, and where we learned that the sufficiency of the righteous are centered in the Lord. He comes to a place of fruitfulness. He lives there, and he says, at last, I have outlasted the enemies of strife. I have outlasted the enemy of contention. I have outlasted the enemy of accusations. And at last, the Lord has brought us to a broad place. But he leaves that for the fullness of God. He moves to Beersheba, where he had this amazing experience of the Lord appearing to him the same night, reaffirming the promise to him, saying, you are going to get the land. You will be blessed in this land. And we also see that, that was not the end of it. He brings back the enemies, and he has this beautiful time of reconciliation, and these people coming back and acknowledging the hand of the Lord upon his life. And at the end, we find that on the same day, they find water. The ultimate water that Jesus offered the Samaritan woman. And I'm taking it a little further, saying that he must have found the ultimate water. But at least, in figurative way, when we want to apply it into our life, we know that, the water that we are all thirsting for is in Jesus.
Yes.
He is the living water. We might be going through situations, and you might be going through steps or stops, or I don't know which. What is happening in your life? I don't know if it is the steps of the Lord that you are, steps of, are ordained by the Lord in your life, or the stops that are ordained that you're facing in your life right now. But, it is not in the steps. It is not in the stops. Our sufficiency is centered in the Lord. And we move, it is not, I am praying that, even fruitfulness will not be, we will not be content with even fruitfulness. We will move towards the fullness of God. Even if we have everything, even if you are centered and you are fruitful, that will unsettle us until we become full of God, until we start using this fruitfulness for the fullness of God, and allowing our lives to be centered for God's work and God's glory. And I am praying this over our church, because I know that each one of us are going through a time where we are waiting on the Lord to see, Lord, how are you going to come for us in this? How we are seeing stops, we are seeing, these things, this famine, lead us to fruitfulness. Please know that the steps of the righteous are ordered by the Lord. The stops of the righteous are ordained by the Lord, and the sufficiency of the righteous is centered in the Lord. God bless you.